Welcome to Got Grass, conversations with the legends and leaders of Bluegrass. You've enjoyed live Bluegrass at Guitar Town CT concerts in Hamden, Connecticut since 2008. From Tony Rice, Rouse Stanley, and Doyle Lawson to Tim O'Brien, Sierra Hall, and Billy Strings. Now you can go behind the scenes as we chat with your favorite Bluegrass stars. I'm your podcast host, Chris Worth. So I want to welcome Austin Scelzo to Got Grass, and I want to clear something up first because your last name, I always pronounce it Scelzo, but I have a feeling that's not the real correct pronunciation.
Well, you caught on. That's actually my entire life. My family and friends have always used the Italian pronunciation, which is Scelzo. But a big mentor of mine in the bluegrass music world, a person who really helped me establish my career when I quit my job as a public school teacher, was Pete Wernick. And Pete Wernick, for many, many months, was telling me that if you're establishing yourself as a professional in the bluegrass music world, where radio and interviews are huge, you've got to have a name that's more easily recognizable or searchable when people hear it. So he pushed for me to change the spelling of the name to Shelzo. But I, as a digital native, a person who grew up in the age of the internet, my name was out there as Scelzo, on the internet in various places. So I compromised with him after kind of pushing back for quite some time with Scelzo, the pronunciation, changing the way that I pronounce it for at least as the stage name per se. And I've kind of stuck with that. And it doesn't feel that odd to me. A lot of my high school friends who also, kind of toyed with the pronunciation would call me like Skels Master or Skelsinator and all these silly, iterations. So it doesn't feel, both of the names feel like things I've heard before.
And I was going to ask you where you're living now, because I know you've moved around a bit. I know you're from Connecticut originally, correct?
That's right. I grew up in Wallingford, not too far from where you are, and I went to school at Danbury, the Western Connecticut State University, and found a place right across the street from my freshman dorm and stayed there for quite some time. I was living kind of communally with people, and they all had regular 9 to 5, so it basically felt like having a place to myself for many years during the daytime hours, and I'd leave for the evenings and things. But I have since moved to a new location in Newtown that I'm very excited about. It's on a property, a very large property that is owned by this husband and wife, Kim and Eric Foyt, who are champions. I tell people that they're kind of a matriarch and patriarch of jam culture in Connecticut, because for many, many years they've been hosting these monthly parties that bring together the community, all sorts of acoustic music fans, and their house gets filled with old time jamming and bluegrass jamming and swing and singer-songwriter. In the summer it even spreads out. And they have big plans for the property to have, a recording studio and a house concert series. And this new kind of guest house that I've been staying at has space for musicians who are coming through the area. I think I mentioned the Clements brothers kind of coming through and reaching out if they know anyone in Connecticut. So that's what this space is all about, community, and they thought that I would be a good fit. I don't know why, but I'm excited to work with them and make more of that happen.
Yeah. Have you lived in Nashville or plan to at some point? It seems like most people from up here eventually go there and either stay or give up and come back. But how about you?
Well, I have, for many of my, mid 20 years, I spent a lot of time soul searching, and, so many folks my age, when they graduate, they if they come back to Connecticut, it's for a short time, because it's expensive to live here. It doesn't have incredible nightlife for many young people and things like that. So it's totally understandable. And it was challenging to watch a lot of my friends leave, but ultimately I kind of had a mission here that kept me in Connecticut. But that's another story. I did go to Nashville for a couple months and kind of couch surfed, as many young musicians do. And I went to Boston and New York City and did the same thing for a couple months just to see the vibe. And by far, Nashville kind of won my heart. I loved the scene there. I loved the jams and the late night hangs, and the dancing there is incredible, and all the shows that are happening. I mean, you can go to a show every night of the week and figure out where to go tomorrow from going to that show. It's just an exciting scene, and I I love it there. But I felt kind of missionally called to, bring my skills as an educator and a leader to Connecticut. And that's kind of where why I decided ultimately to stay here, even though I try to sneak away to Nashville whenever I can.
Did have you in Connecticut, believe me. So Austin, what's your first musical memory? Do you have one as a kid where you heard something? I don't know what it would have been because you're a different generation. I know what mine was, but what's yours?
Yeah, well, often when people ask me, how I started playing fiddle, I start with telling people I was a very uninspired, middle school orchestra student who, my for many, many, many months and a couple years even, I think my parents were just begging me to practice, and I would never, I remember taking the fiddle out in the car from lesson to lesson. I had a local private teacher. From lesson to lesson, I hadn't touched it all week. And in the car on the way to the lesson, as my parents would drive me, I'd try to pluck the song that I was supposed to learn that week. But
Mm.
I do share that my first spark of inspiration was actually before fiddle music or before hearing bluegrass or anything like that. It was hearing this violinist whose name was David Garrett, and he was this absolute prodigy in Europe who kind of burnt out on classical music, and I think in his late teenage or early 20s, and ran away to the US to kind of escape music. But people found out he had, was this monster player, and they kind of poked fun at him. His friends wanted to say, you could play these rock riffs on the radio and stuff like that. And so he was playing. When I first heard him, my grandparents showed me a video of him playing on TV, and he was playing like Nirvana and AC/DC and Led Zeppelin on the fiddle. And I
Huh.
was just blown away by his stage presence and playing the kind of music that had a good groove and feel to it. And I just, was amazed that the violin could do that. And that was kind of the spark of inspiration for me to, I went from never practicing to working out those riffs for hours.
Interesting. I've had a couple of well-known people that I'm sure you know about, Richard Green and Daryl Anger, on the podcast, and I asked them what was their inspiration or what got them so excited in bluegrass music as opposed to classical, and they both said seeing Scotty Stoneman play blew their minds.
Well, yeah, that's a
Uh,
perfect example because Scotty is, such a showman. And in my time as a public school teacher, I felt what I discovered, which was a surprise, is that kids, which are, it's really the same way that most of us perceive music, they're not inspired by raw ability. They're inspired by presence and their connection and an artist's connection to the music. And Scotty Stoneman was a showman, and so was David Garrett. David Garrett would come out of the back of the theater, and he would get on, he would kneel down and play for people in the audience, and he always had these great outfits. Such a contrast to my experience of classical music, which was very buttoned up. You kind of like stay. I mean, we're told not to tap our foot in the orchestra because it makes too much noise, and just such a big contrast. But when I was a middle school teacher, I noticed that over and over again. The middle schoolers that I was teaching, they were not inspired by, the greatest technical players. They were inspired by these, people who would, buskers who would dance and play along to their favorite songs or whatever. Just have a connection to the music. Kinesthetically, that
Mhm.
they saw inspiration in.
So hence Billy Strings,
Billy Strings, hey, yeah.
someone with a lot of pizzazz, a lot of personality, and people relate to him.
And I feel like people aren't really talking much about that element of why people like Billy Strings and Molly Tuttle, for that matter. I just listened to a podcast with Bronwyn Keith Hines, and she talked about when she first joined the, Molly Tuttle's band, Golden Highway, when they were playing. She was the only one who didn't kind of the previous band that she was in didn't kind of move or as much. They weren't as animated, right? And she was the odd one out in that band, and she had to learn to get comfortable, being free with the body and being a little bit more performative in addition to playing great music. And I think, of all the people I talk to about, what makes the average person kind of fall in love with the band. So often the conversation does revolve around being a great musician, but also a great performer, a person who's willing to, on top of playing great music, to look the part, at least look like they're in it.
Well, Brahman was the first person I interviewed on my podcast when I first started, because she had played here with Mile 12 quite a few times, and she was a very quiet member of that pretty subdued band, a great band, but not show people. And I kind of joked that she kind of became this Nordic goddess on stage with Molly, like with the wild outfits. I mean, she really did transform herself into an entertainer. She always could play. So I thought that was kind of fun that she was able to do that because she's kind of a quiet person, but on stage she's a demon on stage, you know.
I know it might have been I probably listened to that exact podcast, and that might be where I heard that story. I
Yeah.
think it's a great story for everybody to hear because it's not, I think it's important for people to realize that it doesn't, kind of freeing your body up. When I was a public school teacher, I would tell the students a lot that when I was a kid, I would kind of play, what's on the page, and I would play for my parents, if I was preparing for the concert, and they would say, "Oh, that's very nice, Austin," you know, but do you think you can kind of, ease up or relax your body or whatever? And I would always say, like my middle schoolers would say, they'd say, "I'm focusing, I'm in it or whatever. My brain's working hard," and the reality is that kind of working on freedom of movement in the body and working on being present in a performance and working on interacting with the audience, that is a separate skill. You have to work on it or it will not get better. And I think, the interview with Bronwyn revealed that she, had to kind of observe what other musicians do when they have that level of presence and in some ways imitate it, which you see a lot of kids outside of bluegrass, like people who are inspired by pop musicians. Kids are imitating not only the singing, but the movements of pop and rock singers. And that's just a reality of a lot of the entertainment business.
You've noticed, and you probably have too, that a lot of the young, very talented technical bluegrass bands that come out of Berkeley and ETSU and so forth, are great players, but between songs, there's not much. Like they turn it back to the audience and talk to each other. The entertainment factor seems to be missing with a lot of young bands. I guess what I'm trying to say, and I think it's very important as an audience member. You're not just going to hear people play amazing riffs. You want to be entertained. You want to be fun. You want to joke. It's part of the whole experience. And I always felt that it's kind of missing with some of these younger bands that.
Absolutely. And that can happen for a number of reasons. It can happen because it's a pickup band. You have people that don't regularly play in that group, so they don't have as much rapport with each other. It could be because, bluegrass is this kind of thing that you have to be obsessively nerdy about, and it takes a lot of time to work to be as proficient as it takes, which, that those are sacrifices that you have to take socially, and I think for both of the groups that I'm a part of, no one went to school for bluegrass. And I think that is a part of the reason why both groups have really good rapport with the audience naturally, because, we went to public schools and we're just around people a lot. And you have to balance the technical ability, especially when it comes to playing for non-bluegrass audiences. For the musicians, they can look past the performative kind of stuff and they just want to hear the notes and they want to
They're
grunt
checking you out.
awesome.
Yeah, they're checking you out.
Yeah, but for the vast majority of people outside of that, they don't know the difference between good and great, and they want to be entertained. They want to be taken out of their lives, their busyness, or the stress of their lives for those couple hours that you get to do that as a performer. And Charlie from On the Trail, we talk often about how important and what a service it is to people to transport them, in the moment of a concert, and how that connection to service and music performance can really give people a sense of purpose outside of just like, why should I play fiddle when there's so many people, who could play more notes? It's not about that.
Yeah. So your path to bluegrass is different from most in that you started out as an educator and then kind of became a bluegrass nut afterwards. Most people, start out playing bluegrass and then eventually they start teaching because either they have to or they like to or whatever their circumstances might be. But you get kind of backwards, right? Compared to
Yeah,
most.
and you know what? It's exactly that path that I have, heavily leaned into because, you know, like most people, uh, we all want to be better. at our music, everybody kind of looks to the next person above them and wishes that they're like, oh, I wish I started earlier. I wish and a lot of my peers that are playing fiddle, they grew up going to fiddle contests. I've never been to a fiddle contest in my life. They grew up going to fiddle contests, or they grew up around the music, or they went to school for it, or they are a second generation or third generation musician. That's not my story. And there's nothing I could do about that card. So instead, I've kind of really leaned into the fact that I have always wanted to be an educator, and I studied music education. I took it really seriously, the craft and the professionalism that's involved with good teaching. And I took that background and I applied it to educational leadership around bluegrass music, which is kind of why the Connecticut Bluegrass Association was started, why I was able to build a career as quickly as I had after quitting my job, around, in addition to performing, sharing the love of this music with people and bringing people together and jams and classes. And the background with when you become a music teacher, you learn to teach choir and band and orchestra. So teaching harmony singing has been, easy for me. Group classes have been easy for me. Managing camps and workshops, organizing my own or helping other people kind of make them successful. All those skills have really helped me kind of build a really fun but also impactful career, I think, in the bluegrass music world.
Yeah. I've talked to quite a few fiddlers on this podcast, and one of them was Maddie Denton. And Maddie was one of those people, as you say, that grew up only playing fiddle contests. And she said when she went to join a bluegrass band, she had no idea what to do. She had never played with, she just would always focus on winning fiddle contests. So she could play any fiddle tune better than anybody else, but she couldn't play with others. And so that was the hardest part for her, was learning how to play with other members in a band, because she just had never done it, even though she could play. It was interesting to hear that from her.
Well, that's why I really pivoted with my what I teach and online and in my group classes. Instead of teaching fiddle tunes or famous breaks from bluegrass solos and things like that, I found this little niche area of the internet that people hadn't really tapped into, which is how to do the 90% of what you actually do in a bluegrass or a country band, which is play backup, play rhythm on the fiddle, improvise over chord changes. All that information I had trouble finding, and I didn't see good instruction online. And so I really kind of made a full dive into building that, and which is a curriculum that I put together called the Roadmap to Bluegrass and Country Fiddle Mastery, which is how I run my group classes and all my, fiddle workshops. It's around this kind of one document that just breaks down the bowing and the rhythms and chopping, and then the harmony aspect of it, playing double stops, kind of the regular double stops and the bluesier or swingier double stops and things like that. And then how these melodies are constructed and how you make up little licks and improvise those sorts of things.
I know you've gotten to play with Michael Cleveland, who is probably everybody's favorite bluegrass player, for good reason. What was that like?
Man, to this day, I got to tell you, well, first of all, I'll start with, when I had the opportunity to play with him for the first time, it was 1 year out of public school. I still had the short hair and the glasses and tucked my shirts in and things like that. And that was at the Podunk Bluegrass Festival. I remember his van broke down. We were talking about what to do and what tunes to play in the workshop. His van broke down. He couldn't make the workshop, but he was really intent on, I was really excited to play with him. So when he got there at like 11, they did this late night jam. And we got to run through some of those things. And I just remember feeling so unworthy to be around, those first few years, especially when I quit my job. I just felt like such an outsider. And I've been so welcomed into the music. So yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, he was so kind. And even though I was terrified to be next to him, he even like my first time at IBMA, he invited me to come like do some twin fiddling with him, just like in his hotel room. I mean, just an incredible guy. And each time I was terrified. Now it's been like 4 or 5 years since I've kind of met him, and it's a little bit less intimidating, but he's just such an incredible player. And I've learned a lot from just being next to him. I mean, even in my classes now, I tell people that when I chop, I actually do his 3-note chops. I mean, most fiddle players do 2 notes, like a double stop, but he really bites in so hard that you can pull 3 notes at a time, like kind of like a mandolin player if they're making like a D chord or a C chord chop, on the lower strings. that's what he's doing, the mandolin shapes on fiddle. And I learned that just being next to him.
Yeah. I first saw him in concert at a Salem barn in Connecticut, and he has that wild chop. So I mean, the band members kind of stay away from him because his fiddle bow, he swings a big arc with that thing, and I mean, it's amazing. I had never seen anybody play like that, and haven't since. But man, he wails on that thing.
And I love it. I love he talks about in that workshop, he talked about the heart of this music is that drive, that the drive that's kind of the interaction between the mandolin chop and the bass, and the fiddle can fill that role. You're saying in all of his playing, he's feeling that as kind of the rhythmic engine behind everything, and he feels like a lot of the musicians out there like that, they don't put enough of that, the heart of the music, which is that drive. And so that chop was, a big inspiration. It's probably the biggest inspiration on my chopping by far. And there's not a lot of fiddle players who you can look to for examples on how to get that sound. And so everybody's kind of doing it in their own unique way. Daryl Enger paved his own way of chopping, and Brittany Haas has a really cool chopping style. And a lot of some of the traditional musicians, or even people like Stuart Duncan, you don't really hear chop that much. He does a lot more shuffling. So, it's just interesting how people learn to play rhythm on fiddle.
I had Jason Carter on, and I was asking about his chop. I said, "How do you do your chop?" Because I have no idea.
Yeah.
I never learned it. I just do it. I couldn't explain it. I guess a lot of these people who were great players when COVID came and they started teaching from home had to explain what they were doing and why they were doing it. And they said, I had so much of a hard time explaining how I play the fiddle and why I play the chop. I never thought about it. I just hit it, so it's kind of funny to hear these great players saying, I have no idea how to play the chop. I just play it.
Well, of course, and I envy those musicians. Growing up around that music, it becomes such an intuitive thing that they never really had to develop a language around what they're doing. It's just it's like learning to speak Spanish or whatever. If you started when you were 3 or 4 imitating sounds that you heard, you wouldn't think about how they're spelled unless you learn how to write or whatever, you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
I've seen that time and time again with musicians that grow up around it. And it's something I wish I personally had more of, but instead of thinking about it from that perspective, I've thought it from the perspective of, well, there's a separate advantage to have learned a lot of these skills as an adult, and especially post having studied music education professionally, because now I've developed the language to describe and discuss these kind of skills with other players. And I find that many adults that are learning for the first time how to play fiddle or mandolin or guitar, they have a really great experience going to a lot of my classes, because I have like the language in the background to get people to repeat things and name things in a way that structure things in a way that makes it easy for people to follow.
So after playing the fiddle or violin for a long time, what do you still struggle with on the instrument?
Oh gosh, intonation is a thing that you never get away from. And even, I've read books about, playing violin. Even people like Yehudi Menuhin, these great classical players will talk about their whole life is this, you struggle to play in tune, especially in certain keys. So that's a matter of just sort of like using your voice, it's a muscle. And if you don't use your voice singing every day, you're not going to have the stamina. You're not going to have the vocal accuracy with pitch. You're not going to have kind of the agility that you might have if you work on it every day. Fiddle is that way with intonation, and bow control, having the smoothness of the bow. I always, if I'm in practice mode, looking in a mirror, working on the bow, long tones, making sure my fingers aren't locking up. I want to see kind of this freedom of movement in this direction, left and right. That you can only kind of make a habit from being a stickler and working at it every day.
That's what Michael Cleveland said. He said, when I do double stops, I just feel like I'm always out of tune. I'm always struggling to make them right. So I said, well, if you're struggling, everybody is, because
Yeah, he's right, man. It's a hard thing. It's hard enough to get one note right on the fiddle. For most people who have ever tried the instrument, playing one note with good tone and with good intonation is hard enough. So if you think about doubling that, having two at the same time with no frets,
And
Uh,
is there a fiddle player that you kind of modeled yourself after, or that you, I mean, obviously there are a lot of great ones. There's somebody that you kind of said, that's how I want to play, or that's who inspires me in the bluegrass world?
yeah, I've drawn influences from a lot of people. My biggest influence by far, and the person who's playing I like the most, is Bobby Hicks.
Hmm.
And I like Bobby Hicks playing because his solos were melodically oriented. They weren't, they had all the things that you want to hear in a bluegrass solo, like the beefy, hard attacks, beefy, double stops, and really slick kind of ending tag licks and stuff like that. But they were always kind of following the melody. And he was big on serving the song. I actually, one of my biggest blog posts on my website is Bobby Hicks tips to playing bluegrass fiddle. I found an old VHS of him talking about how to play bluegrass fiddle, and I transcribed and made some notes about what he talked about. And people find that blog post independent of my website just by searching how to be a better bluegrass fiddler. And anyway, I mean, he's thought a lot about getting out of the way and being a good accompanist to singers and having good timing and good tone and smoothness of the bow and things like that. But lots of musicians have influenced me. I've learned so many instrumentals from Kenny Baker. I've learned the kind of I've worked on the slickness and smoothness and the backup of Stuart Duncan and the chopping and aggressiveness and some of these really cool triple stop licks like I call them party trick shuffle bowings and stuff from Michael Cleveland. So, and I could go on and on, but those are
Yeah,
influences.
yeah, yeah. Um, I was always amazed listening to Bobby Hicks playing backup behind, say, the Tony Rice Bluegrass album band or something like that. He can play a whole song on the fiddle without getting in the way of the band, which is amazing to me. He'll just play this whole riff thing behind melody while somebody's singing or soloing, and it just works. I don't, because most people, start doing that and they're just getting all over everybody else. And he just, I don't know how it worked, but I've just heard him, Bobby Hicks, do that, where it's like, how does he play that much and not get in the way of everybody else?
I totally know what you mean. I mean, there's this one track I'm on my way back to the old home, and it's in B flat, and he's just for entire verses and choruses doing constant 16th notes or eighth notes or whatever, and he's just sticking right behind the singer somehow. It's sort of like a banjo player plays rolls through a singing or whatever. And I think a lot of it has to do with the tone, with the timing, with the smoothness of the bow. Also, if you have a really bright kind of classical sounding fiddle, he had a 5 string kind of setup, I'm sure like a good bluegrass fiddle, but if a lot of people come from the classical world, if you're doing that and you have a really bright in your face instrument, it's probably gonna, cut over and his just fit right in.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about classical violin and how that is taught and learned versus bluegrass fiddle. I mean, I guess you could start out with even the names violin and fiddle. They kind of mean different things, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah. There's a million and one bad jokes I won't subject you to about that, but
Yeah.
I'm sure your audience has probably heard them.
I think they've probably heard a few of them. Yeah. Yeah. So when you're teaching violin players, classically trained players to play bluegrass, what's the biggest challenge that you face with them?
Yeah, well, by far, I think the biggest challenge with classical players is telling them that, you know, there's a lot of materials that are actually written, like how to play fiddle tunes, and even some people have transcribed bluegrass solos. Almost every time I work with a classical player, they come up with this, PDF of, say, a Vassar Clements solo on something, and then they can rip through that solo because they know how to read and practice really well, right? But then as soon as they're done, they have no idea how to accompany, or even kind of anything about the structure or the form or the chords. And there's so many things beyond just playing the melody and playing something flashy during your melody that is involved with being a good bluegrass fiddler. So, the first step is getting them off the page. And I always tell people, I tell my students that it's really not worth learning these. If you want to be a better bluegrass fiddler, the step as a classical musician is not, the first step is not to learn transcribed solos. It's really a waste of time because oftentimes you work up this great solo and then you go to an actual jam and the key that it's called in is totally different from from what you worked on, and then you have nothing. I mean, they haven't thought about the structure or the shape of the solo in a way that helps them transcribe it. So getting them off the page and encouraging classical violinists to learn how to approximate simple vocal melodies, just and play them in different keys. Things as simple as like London Bridge is falling down. Like, can you play that in D and in G and in A, right? I mean, that's something that even with a college music education like I had in classical music, I just never learned to do. So transcribing is a huge part of it, but also, playing chords and doing backup is a challenge, and thinking about harmony. Some, classical violinists, depending on the program that they're involved in, they might have, and depending on how their brain kind of works, the theory that they learn in college, you can apply to some of this stuff. Arpeggios are what makes up chords, um, and scales and things like that. You can extract some of that and apply it. But a big part of it is, getting them to the right starting point, getting them to use their ears, and all the technical ability that they've worked on applies, especially with double stops.
When you mention chords, I found that a lot of violin players, fiddle players, when you mention the word chord, they go, it's a G chord. They go, what is that? Like, they never learn. Being a guitar player I started on a piano, so I mean, I know about chords and triads and all this stuff. But I guess in violin, you don't really need to know the chord as long as you can play the piece, right? Necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere in classical music education will you ever see chord symbols. I mean, pianists and guitar players, they're used to, if you want to learn a song, you look up the song and it'll show the lyrics and the chords above it. Pianists will see sometimes the chord symbols like on lead sheets. Jazz players, saxophone, trombone, they're going to see lead sheets with the chord symbols above. Nowhere in all of your public music education, even up through being trained at the conservatory level will you ever see a lead sheet,
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just not a part of the education. But it's not really that far removed if you get people to think about it early. It's not far that removed from some of the skills that they work on, like arpeggios, right? And so I just visited a middle school last week, or I was actually presenting at Western Connecticut State University to music educators from around Connecticut. And I was sharing that, so many people in the orchestra programs will start their classes with scales, but they'll just play the scale from the root to the root back and maybe as a round, and that's it. Like, they don't use the scale to find melodies, or they don't improvise on the scale. They don't recognize that scale and the arpeggio maybe that they practice is like related to the structure of chords and things like that. So they're like almost there, but one more step could get, you can get students to understand chords and apply them. Like we were talking about, I was on the trail was there. So Charlie would play a G chord, on the guitar, and I'd teach the teachers to, look at the guitar chord and recognize if they see that shape, they can play a G arpeggio, right? Or any notes from a G arpeggio is going to make up the notes of that chord, and et cetera, following the guitar, which is a big part of the Wernick method, visually using the guitar for information about the chords.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Pete Wernick because he was on this program, and I had a long conversation with him after the interview about his method. I know you're one of his teachers, and I teach some bluegrass classes at the music school in New Haven, and so last year we worked towards a recital twice a year for the set list. So we're all learning songs and to perform them. So it's not really a jam class per se, but Pete said no. Get rid of the tab, get rid of the music stand, which I did this year. And people were like, what? Huh? How am I going to play without music stands? I said, no, you're going to listen. We're going to learn the songs by listening to them, at least to start out with. Obviously now we're working on specific songs. You need to know the lyrics and blah, blah, blah. But I thought that was interesting because I struggled with that last year with the class. Like, people would have all kinds of ways of following along on their iPads. One guy put all the lyrics on a big piece of brown cardboard on the floor, and it's like, I said, "Come on, guys, let's just try without any aids." And it was a struggle. It still is a little bit with certain people, because it's such a crutch, or whatever you want to call it. It helps them do it, but I say, can we play in a different key? I like you said, I didn't prepare it in that key. Well, okay, but let's just try it. So that's been my experience of some people just have a real hard time just going with the flow.
Well, yeah, and I talk. First of all, I'll say that Pete Wernick's method, I just, from a music education background, it is superb. It is just a really well thought out method. And the reason it's well thought out is because after every class he's ever done, he'll ping the students 3 times about how this could be better. And he's just got years and years and years, hundreds and hundreds of classes, thousands of people who have given him feedback on this method. And, that's the reason it's such a well-oiled machine. I talk in my very first class about the danger of sheet music and some of the stuff that's been written educationally. And I share my own story of buying How to Play Bluegrass Fiddle, the book from like Mel Bay or something, and trying to play bluegrass with like a banjo player that was on my college campus and just failing epically because I didn't know what key I was in and I didn't know, anything other than playing the notes there. So is it, part of the other big thing I talk about is, these books that print the songs out are printed in the key that they were sung in rather than using the number system like the Wernick method does. And it locks women out of this genre because all the songs that are printed, all the songs that are open source or whatever that you got, or the earlier songs in bluegrass history where it was just homogeneously one gender. And so unless you're singing a, Bobby Osborne song and you've got an average woman's vocal register, you're just not able to participate or you're not be able to be heard and people just think your voice is kind of soft and weak when in reality if you just move that song up by a third or a fourth, now all of a sudden you've got a real strong, powerful singing voice. So, the instruction is the written instruction is really a big detriment and a problem in bluegrass music education. I think the Wernick method is probably the best one out there to solve it.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit about harmony singing? Because again, in my particular teaching situation, when we're working on a set list for 3 months, I don't really have time to devote much to harmony singing because I just don't have time. We have to work on the songs. Um, and I know you have a great series of videos on YouTube about harmony singing, which a lot of people in my class watch your videos. They go, "Oh, you should see Austin's videos. They're so good."
That's
And I
awesome.
say, "Yes, you should watch them because what's your I don't know. I find a lot of people also can sing a harmony one-on-one, but then when they in a group they gravitate right back to the melody or an octave below if a woman's singing. Like their brain just wants to sing that familiar melody. Do you find that kind of a challenging thing with harmony singing? People want to sing the melody all the time.
Of course, yeah. I mean, that's the most common thing. You gravitate towards the next most powerful voice. Um, and that's I've seen that as a struggle and a problem for many years, and that's why I spent 3 years developing this app with a friend of mine. I don't know if you've checked it out or if you've seen it, but this technology called Part by Heart. You can go to partbyheart.com to go right to the app, or you can find information on it on my website. It's an app that I spent a lot of time thinking about and executing on that helps people work on being a better harmony singer and giving them opportunities to practice singing their part with either just the accompaniment, like just the guitar, or just one voice, or just two voices. If you really want to nail that baritone part, you got to have reps and practice singing your part against another singer. And oftentimes, if you're in a band rehearsal, you mentioned not having enough time to go over it. The purpose of this app is so that at home, people can practice singing with others. They can put on the lead track and they can sing their part either with a little bit of a guide track in the background or completely out. And then once they can sing it as a duet, then they can add this third part. And in the app, you can change the range of the song, so you can change the key that it starts in, and you can loop and listen back to what your part was supposed to be. It's just this resource I'm really proud of to put out in the world, and I think it's really the solution to what you're describing there is practicing it and knowing that harmony part as well as the melody. You've got to. Pete Wernick himself said he was not a naturally good harmony singer, but on the road they would drill it, and drill it, and drill it. They drill that part, and he said you needed to be as comfortable with the harmony part. You need to know it so well. The way he described it, he says, is that's the way the song goes. The baritone part is like more ingrained in your head than the melody, And
Yeah.
I never really had to do that because I've been singing in choirs for my whole life. I'm used to singing around people who sing different parts, but I recognize the challenge in my students. And I think the app is really the great solution. So I encourage people to check that out. If you go to bluegrassmastery.com/harmony, or if you search partbyheart.com, that's the app directly. Either of those will get you to a spot where you can kind of learn more about singing harmony.
A lot of the students who are all adults in my classes have already checked you out. They're always talking about your harmony classes. I know famously Doyle Lawson would, at least the story is that he would get his group together, him, melody, and three other parts. So it's a whole full 4-part vocal. And then he would say, all right, guys, walk around the house and come back. And let's see if we're all still singing the same parts.
I love it. I want to comment on that because the reason I got the idea for this app is because at Pete Wernick's camp, that's how he taught it. He would at the front of the room, he'd have everybody in an auditorium, and he would sing each part and ask people to record it on their phone. And then instead of most harmony singing, I would say 80% of what I've seen instruction in the world is you teach people the part, and then you say, okay, if you have a lower voice, go on this side of the room. If you have a higher voice, go on this side of the room. And you get this big bluegrass choir that everybody oohs and ahs at because it sounds so great. But the reality is, as soon as any of those people aren't next to people singing their part, they're lost. And that's what is really happening in a jam setting, in a band setting. So the choral thing is an enigma. It's something that's exciting and nice to hear, but it's not really skill building. And so the way that Pete Wernick has been doing it in these camps is that he'd have them on the phone and then he'd send them off for 10, 20 minutes working on their own part. And then they would get together in trios and he'd have all his staff of, 10 teachers listen to these trios and give feedback to people, one person on a part. And I thought that was such a fantastic method, but I thought it could be even better. And so the idea of this app was taking that idea, but instead of having to rely on Pete Wernick singing these parts, to have them already in the app, and also instead of having to rely on being able to have the rehearsal time for trio singing, you could practice at home along with one or two other voices. And so kind of that's the idea that I got, and I think you're spot on with this thing that Doyle Lawson. It's funny that you mentioned that because I was just reading something I think Ira Gitlin was saying about Doyle, where at 2 a.m. they were in a jam and he was stopping the jam because the harmony singing parts wasn't right. He's like, no, we're going to do it again like this, and he cared that much about it. A big part of that conversation was people not really caring that much. They just sing what comes to them and they haven't experienced the joy of like what it is to sing real good harmony singing.
That brings me to a point. You just alluded to this, that in a big jam setting, which I was at one last night. So somebody sings a song, sing the verse, and the chorus comes in, and it's kind of like campfire sing along. There's 20 people, and people love to sing, and they like the feeling of being in a big group singing together, and they all know the melody. But as you say, you can't really work on a bluegrass harmony when there's 18 people singing the melody. So I was curious to know how you or Pete maybe looked at that issue, because you want people to sing. A lot of people wouldn't sing on their own, but they'll sing in a group. Maybe it helps them with their confidence, helps them follow a melody, but yet it's not really bluegrass singing, it's campfire singing. So what's your feeling about that?
Well, the very first thing I'd say about that is it's so common in bluegrass jams, and some of this is out of necessity because people don't have the space for it. But what's very common in bluegrass jams is the beginner kind of y'all come welcoming bluegrass jam tends to be 20 plus people. But the Wernick method, unless it's full class instruction, where you're teaching a concept as a teacher and it's kind of like students almost like classroom style looking at the teacher and teacher teaching a concept. Whenever there's actual jam time, a part of the Wernick method is being in groups of like 8 or 9 or less. And so, at the end of every one of my classes, after we've gotten the basics through, I immediately break the classes up into groups that are, 8 or less. So you solve half the problem by keeping the jam small. And in the jams that I run, I try to find spaces where you can do that. I try to find leaders in the community that when the jam hits critical mass, I could say, "Hey, everybody wave at, say Jim or Eric or Jess or whatever, over there. They're going to take you to this other room where you can play fiddle tunes, or they're going to take you to this other room where if you're comfortable playing in B flat and F and B, follow them, and you keep breaking in the groups into spaces where people are listening to each other. They're not overplaying, and you don't have to like harp on it because there's physically less people. Sometimes people will still do that, but the smaller the jam, the more likely is that people will actually pay attention and develop like the right sort of jamming skills. So number one, I'll say, is starting the jam small, but I think there's a place for the all come kind of big bluegrass jam, and I don't think harping on harmony in those particular spaces is maybe the best goal, because a lot of the times people just want to be there to hold down a rhythm on their guitar, and it's a good thing for people to have in a space to do that. I just think as people get a little bit more facility, that breaking them into smaller groups is going to result in better bluegrass jamming all around.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, especially today, I think people really need the feeling of communal singing because people don't get that much in their lives, unless you go to church or belong to a choir, you don't get to sing with other people. So I think a lot of people, let's face it, a lot of this crowd in bluegrass, at least around here, are older, and they just want to sing. So it's almost more important to them to just sing the song rather than working on bluegrass. They're just really there for the community spirit, which I get, and we need that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think it's important to have both of those spaces, and to also, if given the opportunity, as to gradually wean people off of that kind of big, y'all come jam. I mean, the jam that I run in Reading now has the space for one ginormous jam, but also has the space for like 7 different jams if I wanted to. So really what I happen is it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and I allow it to get bigger until it hits a kind of critical mass where I try to break it into different groups and things like that. So I think you're totally right with people, just wanting to connect and be around each other. But I always think about it this way. I think about if you're at a party, you don't expect everybody to stand in a circle the entire time at the party and try to have a conversation in a big circle. No chance. These parties, if you go to someone's house, you're going to see people hanging out in the living room. You're going to see people hanging out in the kitchen. You're going to see people hanging out on the porch. And no one person, like the extroverted people, are going to play in every or talk to everybody in this scenario that I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, most people, even if they're not super extroverted, are at some point going to interact with people in all 3 of those, say, hangout spaces in a party. I tell people that all the time with these bluegrass jams because people think you're trying to be exclusive when in reality you're just trying to like make it so that you can hear each other,
Yeah.
you know? So, I mean, I think it's a good analogy and I use that one often. I think it works for bluegrass jamming.
Yeah. What's your sense of bluegrass these days in general, like where the music is headed, trying to get young people involved in it, which is always an issue up here. I don't know if it is all over the country, but like what's your sense of where bluegrass is right now in the cultural realm?
I'm feeling really, really optimistic, actually. I think bluegrass, for the first time in a long time in history, is culturally probably more relevant than it has been in a long time, with people like Billy Strings and Molly Tuttle, and even like Chris Thile and Steve Martin, and all these people are getting some serious like TV time.
Mm-hmm.
I also think with the rise of screens and AI and technology, people are dying for like the camp experience, or the workshop experience. You're seeing a huge, increase in the number of camps and workshops that are happening around the country, and the number of people who are interested in signing up and doing that. So I'm very optimistic that a lot of more people are going to be learning instruments and wanting to get together and, disconnect from their phones and things like that. I think that it's a challenge in places like Connecticut where, a lot of the younger bluegrass people are in the cities, because that's where young people are. But it appeals to younger people in any kind of demographic or location. You just need to get it to them, which has been a challenge for me, but I have really kind of reveled in the past 5, 6 years that I have been working on building the bluegrass scene in Connecticut. It used to be all people that were 50 and older until just like 2 or 3 years ago. And I remember the first person to come out, one of my bluegrass jams in Bethel because he was learning guitar on YouTube from these instructional videos, and he just really wanted to jam on old Joe Clark. And he came out to this jam. He was the first young person I saw come to one of my jams. And then it just proliferated. I mean, now there's parties that are happening in Connecticut that are just all 20 and 30 somethings playing bluegrass. It's really exciting actually. And I think that's happening in a lot of places. There's more programs. ETSU has been, Berkeley's been around for a long time. ETSU has this program. NEC is embracing kind of non-classical. Colleges everywhere are getting more interested in Appalachian music. So I'm really optimistic.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you could have sat down and played music with anybody in history, just you and somebody on the couch jamming for an hour or two, anybody would particular person would jump to mind here?
Yeah, man. The first one that comes to mind 100% is the guy I mentioned before, Bobby Hicks. And what's really sad,
Okay.
I'll tell a quick story about that, is Pete Wernick, knew Bobby pretty well. And he encouraged me to go meet him when I go to Asheville. I go to Asheville every year to teach, with Christian Howes, this kind of creative strings workshop, helping people learn to improvise. But it wasn't too far from Bobby. And I saw on Facebook when Bronwyn was there, because I followed Bronwyn on Facebook or Instagram. I remember seeing he hosted local jams, and I saw them playing Prosperity Special together and just loved that so much. And I was really excited to meet him. I was planning to meet him that very summer when he passed. And I remember I was at Green Mountain Bluegrass Festival in Vermont, where there was no service on my phone. And I was literally, crazy moment. I was standing in the audience about to hear the Bluegrass Album Band Volume 2 tribute, or Volume 1, I think, tribute, where there was a, cast of characters that were going to perform like note for note the Bluegrass Album Band from top to bottom. And before they started the set, I had no service. Someone went to the microphone to announce that Bobby Hicks had just passed. And then, man, seeing Christian Settlemyer rip into that backup and those solos, just like honoring his passing, was just really emotional. And in fact, the same summer I hung out with Jason Carter and told him what an influence Bobby had on me. And Jason said he was with Bobby just a couple days or a few days or a week or so before he passed. And he said Bobby shared how to play Prosperity Special in this version that he never recorded. And so Jason played that for me, and we got to play it together, and I got a little, experience of kind of spiritually of kind of being with him. And so I just missed my opportunity there, but I've been so inspired by his work. I have this YouTube series that's just all Bobby Hicks, and this blog post about how he talked about being a better fiddler. So love his playing.
Yeah. It's funny story that we had a concert here at the Unitarian Church. I think it might have been 10th anniversary concert, and it was we did a tribute to the Bluegrass Album Band and Manzanita, two like albums, and it was Doyle Lawson, Josh Williams, Ricky Simpkins, Justin Moses, and Todd Phillips. So we did the Bluegrass Album Band set, and then they came to the Manzanita set, and Doyle Lawson goes, "I've never heard that album," and he said, "I've never heard Manzanita album. I don't know any of the songs on it." So he said, and a couple of songs he said, "I'm just not going to play because I don't know them and I don't want to mess up in front of the crowd." But I was kind of surprised but I guess it wasn't his thing. It was just funny.
Well, if I recall correctly, Manzanita, especially in the time that it was released, was not as considered bluegrass. It didn't have banjo.
Right.
It's really interesting listening to that, thinking about how people would have interpreted. I mean, nowadays we're so used to hearing kind of like that, especially in the Northeast, there's a lot of bands without banjo, and there's a lot of traditionalists that would call all of those bands not bluegrass because there's no banjo, But I think that was probably the interpretation of a lot of traditional players back then, and that's like sort of this outside of bluegrass thing, that if you're a traditional person, there's so much traditional bluegrass to learn and study that you might just miss that, or it might not be your thing. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So You're pretty young, but looking back at your life in music, is there anything you might have done differently if you could do it over again, in terms of your bluegrass career or your education career or how things have turned out? Are you happy with the way things have turned out, which is
Well,
pretty good for
I,
you?
I am a very optimistic, pretty joyful person, and I am, not one to look backwards. But I will say that what I missed as a kid is what drives my sense of mission today. And, growing up, people like Daryl Anger and Brittany Haas and all these great players were performing 20 minutes from me. And this, you probably heard of the Fire in the Kitchen series. And I went my entire kid life. It's not a fault of my parents. They didn't know anything about any of this music, but I just was never invited and never heard about it. Wasn't, I didn't have any. My orchestra teachers in school were all choir people that kind of were thrown into the position. It's not their fault either, that they weren't plugged in. So of course, if I were to, uh, I don't even know if I would say this because I've really leaned into kind of how it's fueled my mission. I wouldn't want to change anything, but I will say, I'll just put it this way, that my sense of mission and purpose and the reason I feel so connected to my work and connected to the value of it, is because I want to provide that sort of information, that sort of accessibility, that sort of mentorship to not only young people, but also to people who are excited about this music of all ages, to kind of get them plugged in and to share my excitement for, the music camp experience or the festival experience. To share that with all ages is something I take really, great joy in. And it's because of the lack of, knowledge and opportunity that I had as a kid.
It's funny because I got to know Charlie Schaefer, who did that series for all those years pretty well. He was also a contractor, as I was. I would run into him at the lumberyard and stuff. So I only knew about the series kind of through that connection, but he definitely was focusing on string players always. And he always had to make not just bluegrass, but all kinds of world string players came there and played. A lot of the shows I went to, a lot I didn't, but yeah, it was quite a education over there to see some of these people.
Some of my, biggest influences today were playing right around the corner from me, and I had,
Mm.
yeah.
So, what's on your wish list or bucket list for the next couple of years? You're gonna keep going with what you're doing in Connecticut and all these. I mean, you're doing so many things. You're getting a lot of recognition from IBMA around the country. Obviously, you're very motivated to do what you do, and you do it really well. So, what's coming up for you that we might not know about?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, I have hit to the point where there's so many projects that I am happy with their, having been established over kind of the past kind of 3 or 4 years of pushing like the camps that I run. I'm not thinking about, I've had to hold myself back from starting yet another camp. I mean, I toyed with the idea of doing a harmony singing camp, but I've been doing local classes instead and focusing on the app. There's always harmony singing instructions at a lot of the camps that I'm involved in, whether I'm teaching there or running it myself. So I'm trying to pull back the throttle on starting new camps and things like that. I'm excited about getting the app some more attention and getting that out into the world. I am excited about the local work that I'll be able to do here, helping kind of establish more community jams and um, possibly house concert series and things like that at the local level. I do have a 3 to 5, year plan to release a solo album with folks that I admire and have worked with over the years, and I'm really interested in putting some of my own instrumental songs, instrumental pieces, and songs that I've written on there, in addition to songs and instrumental pieces that were written by people around New England, or around my travels. Like there's a singer songwriter um, from Canada that I really admire, and I've learned one of their songs that I really love. So, I'm kind of brewing some sort of a solo project that kind of celebrates New England and its diversity of music.
Hmm. I mean, I've seen some of your posts on Facebook where you're saying kind of, I really need to kind of pull back a little bit. I'm going in so many directions. I'm burning myself out, and I'm amazed that you haven't. Or maybe you have a little bit, but I mean, you do so many things, and you do them all well with a lot of passion, and and love. So it's just you impress a lot of people, including me, with all the stuff that you do and get and succeed at. Yeah, it's quite fun to see.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It's taken I think when I reflected, I got really sick at the end of the tail end of IBMA this year.
Mhm.
Just when the fun began, there's a business conference, and you got to be on it with your, networking and all that. And then the weekend is like the festival where the jamming happens, and Thursday night where the best jamming happens because of the award show. I came down with this huge sickness and I was in bed the entire next 3 days. But it forced me, as sickness often does, it forced me to reflect on what has happened that year. And I had just received the industry involvement award from IBMA, and so I was reflecting on what that meant. And I really wanted to share this message that I was never a competitive. Even today, I'm not very competitive of a person, and I never kind of chased awards or accolades or anything. But my brother, who's told me this thing once where he said, you know, an award is not, it's just a piece of glass or metal or whatever. What it really does for the community, or the reality, the benefit of having an award culture per se or whatever, is the moment where the person receives the award, they get up in front of the audience and they share what it took to get there. And I took that to heart when I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to say, and it was a scary moment to get in front of all those people, all the people in the industry. But ultimately, I'm proud, and I really believe in what I shared in, which is that you know, you got to take risks and pursue your dream. And if you are really chasing that, it kind of fuels. I mean, you have this otherworldly fuel behind what you do because it's all connected to your sense of mission and purpose. And so following your dreams and kind of taking that risk and diving deep into it is a big part of what I wanted people to share, but also the sacrifice that it took. I was doing almost nothing but working, for most of my 20s, just building all these things and, putting all these things that a lot of people are trying to establish, like balance, on the back burner. And I wasn't dating and wasn't my social life suffered in some ways for during those years. But you really kind of, if you have this passion and you put some time into it, especially when you're young. Now I'm experiencing the freedom that those years of pushing and those years of hyper focus kind of has awarded me. So I shared that I hope that was an inspiration to whoever's kind of thinking about their passion project.
Yeah. I remember taking a mythology course in high school, private school, and we were reading A Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, and I flunked the course. But he said one thing which I thought was very good, prophetic. He said, "You have to follow your bliss,"
Hmm.
and I thought that it pretty sums up. I think it sums up your energy and approach, right? You follow your bliss, and good things happen.
Absolutely. It reminds me of Pete Wernick, talking about, I see in him, when he watches the student concert at the end of his big camp, I see him and Joan holding hands, looking up at all the students playing bluegrass, struggling to get through, a 90 beats per minute version of Take This Hammer, you know, but they're doing it. And to see the joy that he has, he describes it as the teacher's heart, and it's something that when I saw him, I felt the same level of joy. I was like, he gets it. He gets this thing that not everybody has, this desire to to share this music and to encourage people and to mentor others. And that's just, I mean, that's as much as I love performing, I do. Performing for me is a very similar thing than teaching in the fact that it's a service to others. And my connection to that is kind of what I think is really what drives so much of the energy behind it.
I think that's a good place to stop. You've covered a lot. I appreciate you coming on. I mean, you're very inspirational, at least to me, and I think to a lot of people listening as well. So I hope we catch up at some point down the road. Maybe play a few tunes together at some point down the road. But it's been great having you on, Austin.
I love that. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Okay. So we're good now.
All right.
Yeah. So thanks. That was fun. That was fun.
Thank you,
So
man.
Who is your publicist? She contacted me, and
Yeah. So
I've been thinking about having you on forever, and I just, I mean, finally you're on, but it was nice that she did because, life goes on. So it's good.
Totally. And I'm so grateful for, I told myself before I turned 30, I wanted to build a team. And I didn't do that to the way that I had it in my brain is not necessarily that I wanted to have like a, in addition to, when we have the label, I have a person I can call to for social media. I've got, now Gab.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast, and thanks for listening. Visit our website, guitartownct.com, for concert and podcast schedules, or just to send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.